earned his PhD in international relations, political philosophy, and Islamic political thought from Georgetown University in May 2000. He founded the Islamic Studies program at the University of Delaware and was its first director from 2007 through 2010. He is an expert in political Islam, Muslim politics, Islamic political philosophy, and the U.S. foreign policy. Professor Khan to address.
Good morning, everybody. Issues, but I wanted today, one was that even some of the most profoundest political transformations can be made through non-violence activism. So change can be brought peacefully. And the other message that he sent was that in the end, truth will always prevail. I don't know why we think about it in the end. I think truth will always prevail. So it is important that on this particular day we are addressing these issues. The picture that you see on the slide is a picture of a book that I just completed. It's called Islam and Good Governance, a Political Philosophy of Ihsan. It is an attempt to show, particularly to young Muslims and Muslims who are engaged in the political sphere, that the Islamic values that they so aspire for can be realized in most beautiful ways. It's based on a tradition of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in which he quotes God and says, God has commanded Muslims to essentially do beautiful things in everything that they do. Inna Allaha kataba al-ihsan ala kulli shay. So if you are commanded to do beautiful things in everything that we do, then the question is, why not in politics? Why does it have to be so ugly? Why to global war on terror, or as they may have been last year? So as US priorities change, US spending on the global war on terror will also shift. And it's quite possible that those programs which have been initiated abroad under the umbrella of CVE may suddenly find the funds drying out. So as a result of that, it is important for you as you go forward, smaller countries which depend on US funding to wage these CVE campaigns, to start reflecting on what the future would be. So essentially, I'm going to give you a 30,000 feet view of US grand strategy, how it evolves, and especially with regards to the global war on terror and the CVE component and what is potentially going to happen in the next 2 years. Let's talk a little bit about, I realize, what is CVE? The VE part is the critical aspect of it. So when President Bush responded to 9/11, the title of his campaign was the Global War on Terror. And the United States made the case that groups like Al-Qaeda are a global menace and they cannot be surgically targeted. We have to fight extremism and terrorism wherever it is because it threatens all of us. And so the United States responded by declaring a global war on terror. Several years later, especially in the second term of President Obama, we made this correction, and then we started calling it not as global war on terror, but essentially countering violent extremism, recognizing several things. One of the things was this whole idea that extremism is not limited to Muslim societies alone. So just talking about Islamic threat and Islamic terrorism is not the issue. We need to expand the term. And the word terrorism also was being contested as to what constitutes terrorism. And therefore, to essentially get around the problem of the definition of terrorism. Very broadly, the word violent extremism was used. And it was not just extremism, because at least in the United States, you're allowed to have extreme views. And in some cases, you can also indulge in expressing those extreme ideas. However, acting upon them is illegal or dangerous, and therefore the expression violent extremism rather than just countering extremism. So in that sense, CVE was a new way of thinking about counterterrorism. So instead of just talking about counterterrorism, we're talking about countering violent extremism. And the term is broader than just terrorism, because terrorism is just an act. Extremism can be more than just an act of terrorism. In some ways, CVE for the United States was primarily a domestic dimension of the war on terror, because overseas we were fighting it literally in the form of a war with military presence in the US military in Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly, where the hot, or you could talk about the military aspect of the war on terror. But how would you deal with people who were getting radicalized at home and then who were then joining these groups, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS? Especially, you saw in Europe a sequence of attacks that took place in many parts of Europe, often inspired, if not motivated, by ISIS or Al-Qaeda. And so that also became the domestic front of terrorism, inspired by international actors like ISIS as well as Al-Qaeda, then needed to be addressed. And this paradigm of countering violent extremism was formulated. So if you notice, while the global war on terror sought to crush the radicals, CVE was designed to prevent it. So it was designed to not only prevent radicalism, but it was also designed to, in many ways, preempt it. That is the most difficult part of it. As law enforcement officers will tell you, that unlike other crimes where you act against a criminal after the crime is committed, there is no preemption of robbery, there is no preemption of murder, but we want to preempt terror because once it's committed, it has such profound, devastating effects. So in that sense, combating terrorism is profoundly different from fighting other crimes, and that was the reason why the United States initially talked about it as a war rather than fighting crime. So CVE is also about reversing those who are already radicalized. So we assume that there is a process of radicalization. We try to understand how this process works. We also believe that there is a tipping point at which a person who becomes radical then may act upon that, and so the idea is to intervene. It looks very good in PowerPoints than it does in real life, really. And another aspect of countering violent extremism was essentially the battle for the hearts and minds, the combat of ideologies, the war of ideas, and so the production of counter-narratives. So the idea was that we not only have to win the battle on the battlefield, but we also have to win the battle in the social media, in op-ed articles, in books, and essentially what people are thinking all about. So CVE is this comprehensive strategy to combat radicalism. And of course, I'm saying all of this while recognizing the problem of the very term, who is a terrorist, what is radical, what is extreme. Because for some people, extreme is normal, and vice versa. What we think in the United States should be the normal can be extreme secularism for people in religious societies, and what we see as extreme in religious society may be something that they really aspire for in those societies. The CVE model was exported by the US overseas, because by exporting the CVE model, the idea was that when countries overseas also adopted the same methods of combating radicalism or emerging radicalism, preventing and reversing radicalism, then those countries would also become the front line in fighting global terrorism. So the US will not have to come and fight terrorists in Trinidad if the Trinidad's government is already engaging in CVE. So ideas, resources, intelligence sharing, etc., can be provided through global national networks fighting terrorism. But essentially, it's like saying we were gearing all other countries to join this global war on terror by adapting strategies, techniques, language, etc. The conference is called Prevent and Counter Violent Extremism. Prevent is another model that the British government uses, and that is essentially a domestic model. So you can see how language and ideas and strategies emerging from the core of Western countries like the UK and United States are now becoming global responses to terrorism and radicalism. But the point that I really want to make in this conference is make no mistake that CVE is the key element of the global war on terror. But if the United States were to move away from the global war on terror, so would CVE. And that is a key aspect. It has become a big, big industry. Several years ago, when I was a fresh PhD and I was engaging in international relations for the first time, I was at a peace conference in Manila, and there were like 150 NGOs, peace NGOs, and people were all talking about such wonderful things. And I realized that if there was peace in Manila, all these people would be out of jobs. All those NGOs would have to shut down. All the foreign funding for these initiatives would dry up. And I had this horrible feeling that peace was not in the interest of peacemakers. So peace was not in the interest of peacemakers. They would have to go look for another job. And so I said, oh my God, no wonder there is no peace. Because peace was not in the interest of peacemakers. And so similarly, CVE has also now inspired a huge industry. Scholars, funding, travel. I mean, I had the choice to speak in Albania or Trinidad. I'm giving a talk by video in Albania, and we thought you had great beaches, so we picked Trinidad or Albania. I'm just kidding, but the point I'm trying to make is that there is a global industry for this. There are corporations and consulting firms and NGOs, etc., depending on foreign funding. And so if the United States were to change its grand strategy, it will have a huge impact. I have a feeling that some countries who rely heavily on US or Western funding and have changed their methods of dealing with various problematic groups in their own societies based on the US model and the US resources may have to rethink how they address those issues in the near future. I just wanted to say that the US grand strategy broadly depends on two things: external strategic environment and domestic ideology and context. And I'm going to talk a little bit about both of them. But first, I want to give you a quick historical primer to changes in US grand strategy. The difference between grand strategy and regular foreign policy is that grand strategy is an umbrella approach which identifies not just goals and means, but also the values and principles and the vision that identifies US approach or to its foreign policy and its national security policy. So we all know that from 1945 till 1989, the United States was engaged in a Cold War, an arms race with the Soviet Union, propaganda wars. I mean, today we think that the battles on social media are new. The propaganda wars are very old. They're just the mediums have changed. And the US grand strategy initially was to contain the spread of communism. And after the United States realized and the West realized that they had a significant advantage in terms of resources and capabilities over the Soviet Union, the strategy was essentially changed from containment to rollback. And so we basically effectively rolled back the communist threat to such an extent that the Soviet Union does not exist to this day. Then from 1989 to 2001, the United States, without a major threat and challenger to its global hegemony and domination, essentially promoted a global neoliberal order. You saw the age of globalization, multilateralism, promotion of democracy. Democracy expanded the fastest in this particular period. Enormous amount of wealth was generated, and so on and so forth. So this is the age of globalization, of multilateralism, the dream of Bill Clinton to some extent. And then from 2001 to 2016, more or less, the United States has been, the grand strategy has been the global war on terror. Some of these elements have been axis of evil, combating axis of evil. This is a Republican thing. So George Bush was talking about the axis of evil, which was Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. We made a tremendous mess of Iraq, and now we have Iran and North Korea left. So the new Republican president that comes in is essentially, if you notice, the two of the biggest initiatives that he has taken, which is reaching out to North Korea and trying to essentially bring about regime change in Iran through strengthened sanctions, canceling JCPOA, is trying to finish the job of dealing with the axis of evil, which is part of G.W. Bush's global war on terror. And part of the global war on terror was nation building. And even though one of the biggest elements of combating terrorism was this assumption that democracy is an antidote to terrorism, and by promoting democracy in countries, we would be able to promote or eliminate terrorism. Take a look at the land of Gandhi, and you can see both terrorism and democracy coexisting. Political violence, lynching, riots, etc., all seem to coexist with democracy. So I don't know why we assume. I mean, you don't have to go to third world countries. Look at New Zealand. Look at the violence in the United States and other parts of Europe too. So the assumption, I think, that democracy is necessarily an antidote to terrorism, I think, is fallacious. However, there's an element to it which is, rationally speaking, valid, which is that if agents who want political change cannot get it through democratic means, then they will use violence. So if we create democratic opportunities for people to bring about change, then we assume that they will adopt democracy and eschew violence. So that was the basic assumption. But the global war on terror, the duration from 2001 to 2016, is also the period where democracy has been receding worldwide. So rather than promoting democracy, maybe we did, but the net outcome is that democracy has receded significantly since 2005 to 2006. The world is far less democratic today than it was 15 years ago. So much so that the United States on Democracy Index is not rated as a full democracy. Even the US is not rated as a full democracy. And that is something that we need to really think about. More and more countries are sliding back on all the measures of democracy. And one of the biggest things has been freedom of speech. The war on terror has eliminated the protection of several forms of human rights. So on human rights protection, on civil rights issues, on freedom of speech issues, we have been moving backwards to such an extent that the United States is now not considered as a full democracy by the very institutions that it helped create to measure democracy and promote democracy worldwide. So you can look at Freedom House indexes or etc. Not only that, in this period, the United States, which engaged in a global engagement to combat extremism and terrorism, also began to essentially pull back. And I think it began with the Libya policy of President Obama. And this phrase, leading from behind, essentially means, it's like when you don't feel like going somewhere, carry on, I'll join you. That was the attitude. And usually, carry on, I'll join you, followed by an inshallah means he's not showing up. So I thought that this is the beginning of US disengagement on many issues of the world which are problematic. And then finally now, since 2016, I don't know what happened in 2016. The world seems to have changed after that. US grand strategy has changed significantly. We have now moved to this America First policy. But what is significant is, for those of you who are really interested in this, to go and read the national security document that was released in 2017 October by the White House, in which they talk about the changed US national security policy. And in this changed national security policy, what is apparent is the United States has now moved away from the global war on terror. Now the US priorities is back to geopolitics. So essentially what is happening is that the last column is going to look more and more like the first column. So we are back into an era which is going to look very similar to the Cold War. But the nature of the Cold War is different. We are going to see hybrid warfare. So since 2015, the United States is being incessantly attacked by Russia. American elections have been interfered with. The social media attack, the hybrid warfare that Russia has been waging against the United States is unbelievable. It has changed America, it has undermined American democracy, it's interfering with the trajectory of America's political progress. And of course, the trade wars with China. This is the new forms of Cold War that you are seeing. And then the new forms of propaganda wars. Fake news is the new thing that is replacing fake propaganda that you used to see from the Soviet Union. And then you also see that in the last column, the things that were being achieved in the second column are also being reversed. The age of globalization is over. We are now moving into the age of deglobalization. So the key for us is really moving back is to look from the second to third column, what has happened, or rather the third to the fourth column. And I will speak a little bit more about that and for you to understand exactly how that is going to impact US foreign policy. Okay, the shifts in global strategy and shifts in global strategy and environment and US strategy. So when we said the US is now returning back to geopolitics, it is because, number one, according to the National Security Council, the US now sees Russia and China as the biggest global challenge to the United States. Russia is challenging US hegemony in Eastern Europe. Russia's military incursions into Ukraine. Can you imagine in this day and age a country annexing another country? I thought this was the privilege of only Israel, but now even Russia has annexed Crimea. It's like olden days, empires are expanding territorially. So Russia is a big challenge. Russia's presence in Syria, Russia's growing ability to project power in the Middle East and impact politics in the Middle East is a new challenge for the United States. For decades that the US has been used to being the only superpower in the Middle East, and now suddenly it faces challenge from both Russia and China in the Middle East, especially on issues of trade. Yesterday, the Indian foreign minister made a very interesting comment and said, from the East, Iran looks very stable. Iran looks like a very stable status quo power, essentially saying that we are not threatened by Iran. It may look so from London and Tel Aviv and Washington, but not. So to the United States, this is a challenge, that the US view of the world is now being questioned. And so the United States is now back in this geopolitical game. So Russia is the new challenge on security issues. China is the new challenge. Essentially, in the global economy, that is where China likes to play, but the implications are of security nature, especially if you see with what is going on in Hong Kong. And if you notice, China celebrated its 70th anniversary or birthday this week. And how did it celebrate that? By having a massive, massive parade. A military parade, trying to project to the world how much more powerful China. There are two regional threats that the United States continues to see, North Korea and Iran, primarily because of their nuclear programs. Countries which have nuclear weapons cannot be bullied. So the fewer nuclear weapons out there, more countries can be bullied. I remember in 2002 when we were so eager to attack Iraq and not North Korea, I realized that the reason why we were eager to invade Iraq was because we were sure they didn't have nuclear weapons. And the reason why we have never invaded North Korea in the past few years is because we are damn sure that they have nuclear weapons, and we have seen proofs of that. So in many ways, nuclear weapons do guarantee security for countries, and the United States would like to keep it to a great extent minimal, because we feel that it may trigger arms races, and the more nuclear weapons are out there, the more likelihood of accidents, accidental wars, and accidental usage, even by non-state actors. The hybrid wars and cyber info-terrorism, this is one of the biggest challenges that the United States faces. It is impacting our youth, it's impacting our politics, it's impacting our democracy. The threat is very, very serious, far more serious than anything that ISIS or Al-Qaeda can present to the United States. And gradually there is a recognition of it, that this hybrid warfare needs to be combated. International migration, which is changing the demographic nature and identity of the West itself, and is now becoming far more immediate. Climate is also an issue, but unfortunately, under the current administration, it has not been prioritized. But I think eventually wisdom will prevail, and climate change will become the biggest national security threat, perhaps for all countries in the world. All of that will mean that we are going to be moving away from this global war on terror as a global dominant paradigm of dealing with national security and as the most important guide of US grand strategy. The second thing that is happening with these changes is the end of globalism. The United States is moving from multilateralism to bilateralism. And I think partly because the current president of the United States thinks in a very zero-sum fashion. He can't understand why at the United Nations, for example, the United States and Trinidad should have one vote each. So he thinks that if we eliminate multilateralism and have bilateralism, so every time the US engages with Trinidad or Guyana or India or Iran, the US is more powerful and richer, and so the US will win that engagement, whether it's a dialogue, whether it's a trade argument, whatever. So because he thinks that the US is going to win every bilateral engagement, it is in our interest to have bilateralism and not multilateralism. In multilateralism, the United States could get voted out, except in the Security Council where it does have a veto, but elsewhere the US, so you've seen the United States withdrawing from several international organizations and treaties because it feels that its interests are not as safeguarded as it would be under bilateral situation. Another shift that we see, which will have an impact on strengthening the trends in deglobalization, is that the United States is now weaponizing trade. It's a weaponization of trade rather than aid. In the past, we have used aid as a carrot and withholding of aid as a stick. So all the aid that has been ended for the Palestinians, for example, is an example of how the US has used aid as a weapon. It can be both a carrot and a stick. And now we are weaponizing trade. And it stems from this assumption of bilateralism, that the United States is a stronger economy and we can, essentially deal with you and we can weaponize our markets. If you stop buying your goods, what will happen to your economy? And so on and so forth. So the weaponization of the trade may be, in the short run, advantageous to the United States, but it will end the global neoliberal economic order very rapidly. And so in many ways, this back to geopolitics may end globalism. If we are focused on a global war on terror, multilateralism and international cooperation becomes very necessary even for the United States. We want everybody in the world cooperating with the US. If you are a police officer in this neighborhood, if two kids are sitting in your cafeteria and planning to attack the US embassy or go to Miami and do something, we want the police officer in that cafeteria to act in the US national interest and report them. We need international cooperation everywhere. But if we are moving away from that model, and now we are focusing more on trade issues, etc., then it's quite possible that the multilateral world may begin to diminish, with which will end globalism. There also seems to be an instinct of disengagement as opposed to engagement. In the past, the US was more interested in engaging. Now we seem to be less interested in engaging. And there seems to be more in the US interest to disrupt rather than to bolster the global order. For example, we have become cheerleaders for Brexit. Brexit is not good for anybody, not for Britain, and certainly not for Europe. Yes, maybe Germany and France will eventually be able to have an army of their own without Britain. I don't know how it's going to go, but certainly not good for Britain to be out of Europe. And a weakened Europe is not in the interest of the United States at all. So this cheerleading of Brexit, I really don't understand. But it is coming from this instinct to end globalism, because globalization, multilateralism, and globalism have put a constraint on US exercise of power, and also the changing demographics because of the international regime of accepting mass global migration. It is that instinct against the global migration, which is also an instinct against global order. But the biggest thing is that the United States has a new enemy. So we have this new challenge of right-wing extremism. You saw the most spectacular version of it in New Zealand. A man walks into a mosque in Christchurch, and it's like a video game. He goes around shooting and killing people. This man was visited. He was an Australian, traveled widely in Europe, got radicalized in Europe. We should be asking the question, what is it about Europe that radicalizes people? Have you noticed how many thousands of fighters have gone from Europe to join ISIS? We never asked this question. What is it about European culture that radicalizes people? We just keep asking, what is it about Islam that radicalizes people? No, it's Europeans. These are Europeans born in Europe, educated in Europe, living in European culture, then getting radicalized and going and fighting in Iraq, and now going into a mosque and shooting them. People. There is a lot of denial. If you Google my name, Muqtadar, Director of CIA, and white nationalism, I wrote very recently about a public argument I had with a former director of CIA as to how the inability of Western governments to really recognize the threat of white terrorism and white nationalism as an extremist movement actually facilitates that, and it will delay our ability to act about it. But eventually it will happen. While in the top, you don't see in the United States so much recognition of this threat. When you talk to FBI and law enforcement, you recognize that bottom up, there is a recognition that this is the biggest threat now, and we need to find ways to deal with it. It's going to be far more difficult than dealing with the so-called Islamic terrorism because it supposedly comes from abroad. Look at this chart. What you see on top, I'm getting, I think I went, okay. What you see on top is a headline from Time magazine which says, "We are being eaten from within. Why America is losing the battle against white nationalist terrorism." And then if you see this chart on the right, all those dots that you see are all places in the United States where white nationalists have committed acts of terrorism in the past 10 years. There are so many incidences. And the circle chart that you see is from a report by ADL, which argues and brings about two interesting things. It shows that there have been 427 acts of terrorism from 2009 to 2018 in the United States, and 73% of those acts of terrorism in the 9 years from 2009 till 2018 have been from white terrorism. or nationalist, right-wing, whatever you want to call them. Only 2% comes from left-wing terrorism, and only 23% comes from so-called Islamic terrorism. But there is also a problem with that data because of the way things are classified. Last week, a Hispanic man drove a car into a mall. He is considered to be mentally unstable, but that has been classified as an act of terrorism. Dylan Roof walks into a church, kills 9 people because of his hatred for black people, and it's not classified as terrorism. He's prosecuted for 9 homicides, for committing 9 murders. But if you just add Dylan Roof as a domestic terrorism, that strategic data will change. A Muslim man who was struggling with his own sexuality walks into a gay bar in Orlando and shoots 49 people. And it's immediately classified as terrorism when we have other interesting categories like mass shooting, or he is mentally unstable. And that is not happening. And so this data is also biased politically. It overestimates other forms of terrorism and underestimates right-wing terrorism in the United States. Which means that resources are not allocated at the moment to fight this threat. The world is not being restructured to fight right-wing extremism. And it need not come from white people alone. In the West, it is coming from the white. In India, it's coming from Hindu nationalists. That is right-wing extremism, lynching people for what they eat. Some of the supporters and funders of cow vigilante in India seem to enjoy their burgers in the United States. It's okay for them to eat beef in the US, but they are lynching people who eat beef in India, allegedly. So there is right-wing extremism in many parts of the world that you can see in Africa and others, and we're not paying as much attention to it unless it comes from Muslims. And in 2018, in the entire year, all people in the United States who died as a result of acts which have been classified as terrorism has been right-wing terrorism. All people who died in the US in 2018 were because of right-wing extremism. So eventually, the administration is going to recognize this new threat and start acting on it, which means that the global war on terror may be redefined. There may be no global war on terror, but some Western countries will start addressing this issue far more seriously. There will be reallocation of resources. Even intelligence sources will be redirected. Already FBI is spending more time looking at extremist groups which are domestic. We use the word domestic terrorism as a word to define this. And it is also quite possible that within a year, this data bias may also disappear. As the partisan tension in the US between Democrats and Republicans increases, prosecutors who are Democratic are now becoming more eager to charge right-wing extremists as terrorists than they were in the past. So I think that you will see that change also. This is some data from Europe. I have colleagues from Europe who are here. I will leave them to talk about it. But what I want to show to you are 2 things. The chart that you see, the bar graphs on your left, the bar graph on your left shows the steady increase of right-wing attacks in Europe from 2012 to 2017. So 2017 had over 30 right-wing attacks in Europe. On the chart on the right that you see, the dark green is support for Islamic terrorism in Europe. And when we say support, it's not just vocal support, we are talking about actual support. And the light one is on right-wing extremism, and by 2017-18, in Europe, the 2 are being seen as equal threats from just the. And that is fine. I've spoken to many European experts, and they have actually, they don't have that much political disagreement on this issue. So Europe probably will be ahead of the United States in making this adjustment to the new threat of right-wing extremism. And also that means that funding will change. The reason why we will continue to see more of a danger of Islamic terrorism in Europe is primarily because of two things. The whole issue of transnational migration from war zones like Iraq and Syria into Europe and the tensions it is creating, but also because many of the Europeans who went to fight in terrorist groups like ISIS are coming back home. And if they go back home and if they are undetected, then it's quite possible they may assimilate back into society, but if they are monitored, then they will continue to remain a security challenge. And for many countries, it is problematic what to do with this. Tiny countries like Finland have more than 60 people who have gone and joined ISIS, fought with ISIS, and then have come back home. Some of the European countries are not legally ready to handle the threat because they don't have laws on the book. So if you go abroad and shoot people and come back, you've not broken any domestic law, so what do you do with you? And so Europe will continue to face the challenge with ISIS, etc. The elimination of the ISIS caliphate will definitely reduce recruitment because now it's not a successful model. People, when it was rising, when it was expanding, there was a romance and charisma, and young Europeans and Muslims all over the world were excited about it and wanted to join it. Now that it has become a loser, they are suddenly thinking, well, what kind of a caliphate was it? It didn't last too long and it's completely gone. So its failure has reduced recruitment globally, but that does not mean that the fighters don't exist. By some counts, there are at least 30,000, 40,000 of ISIS fighters who are still globally dispersed. Some of them are in Afghanistan finding a new home, and they are growing there. In fact, I predict that ISIS might be a bigger threat than Al-Qaeda or the Taliban very soon, based in Afghanistan. And they are also merging with groups like Boko Haram in Africa. It is quite possible that if this Kashmir issue continues, and the way India is treating the Kashmir issue as an occupation, I won't be surprised if an ISIS Kashmir were to emerge in that area. So ISIS and Al-Qaeda are not going to disappear as a threat for some countries where the problems are, the root causes need to be addressed fundamentally. However, for the United States, I think the biggest challenge will become white nationalism, alt-right nationalism. Neither party is capable or willing to deal with the immigration challenges that the United States faces, and as long as the immigration issue continues to be a problem, xenophobia, anger, hatred against foreigners will continue, and I think it will feed the fuel. I recently went to Chicago, and there was some problem with the car rental thing, so I was standing in the line, and there were like 200 people in the line. It was an expensive time to rent a car. So everybody looked very upset. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the night. So I decided to crack a joke. I said, as an immigrant, I wish I had stolen the job of a more richer man. Then I could have just rented a limo. It was total silence, and then everybody burst out laughing and the tension was released. But I realized that everybody seemed to be, this is in the back of people's mind as they feel the pinch of the economy. If the economy is doing well, and everybody has jobs and they're doing well, then it's fine. But a large segment of the American population in the ages of 50 to 65 has been completely marginalized economy from an economic perspective because of those 2 decades of globalization, and it's impossible to retool them and bring them back into the economy. So there is a profound resentment towards the global order. And it seems to disproportionately affect people of one particular race. This is the first time in America's history that the next generation of Americans will necessarily be poorer than the current generation of Americans. This is counter to America's dream. This is counter to what America was. We took it for granted that the next generation will do better than the current generation. But the first time, It's not a speculation. Yes, individuals will do better, but on a macro level, the next generation is not going to do as well as the current generation. So this problem is going to endure significantly, and I expect in the next 10 to 15 years that the global war on terror will not be a big issue. There will be an American war on dealing with certain inequities. One final thought is that there is a global problem, and particularly in the United States, of inequity. And by inequity, I mean this enormous disparity in net worth and wealth. So a huge amount of wealth is being concentrated in very, very few hands. I think the top 1% of American population now owns 70% of America's wealth, or even more. And this disparity is completely undermining America's democracy, because the rich can literally buy the policy they want, buy the country they want, buy the president they want. I jokingly say that in the United States now we don't have elections, we have auctions. If you don't have $500 million, or if you don't have the capacity to raise $500 million, don't even think of running for the White House, because that's what it's going to cost. So in many ways, this disparity in wealth has also undermined the idea of a democracy where everybody is treated as an equal citizen, and all of this is going to generate domestic resentment and domestic instability, and all of this are going to overwhelm the so-called threats that are coming from outside. The threats are not diminishing, but the domestic threats are expanding to such an extent that I think that we will have to fight. So I want to end as I started, by invoking Mahatma Gandhi. He was not just a preacher of nonviolence, but he also demonstrated to us that we can make profound political changes through peaceful means. I wish we can send that message to our youth. That is the best and the profoundest and most powerful counter-terrorism narrative. Other countries were fighting wars and indulging in terrorism to become independent. India didn't need to do that. But I think the message of Gandhi will become more powerful if India practices it first. Thank you.
In the tradition of great teachers, we were inspired by the presentation, and I didn't warn him that my electronic buzzer would go off as a warning, but he responded to the paper. We will allow one question for Dr. Khan. There we go. In the tradition of great teachers, he made it so clear that you are now ready for the exam without any further questions. Let us give him a round of applause again. Thank you, Dr. Khan. Thank you not only for coming, but for reminding us of the changing faces of the grand strategy of our dear old USA. Thank you so much. We will enjoy a short break. I think there are some goodies on the side. Refresh yourself, and we'll be back in 15 to 17 minutes or so. Thank you.